The order came down quietly, almost casually, which somehow made it worse. Burn the map. Destroy it completely. If capture was even a possibility, leave nothing behind. In the chaos of the Italian campaign, orders like this were routine, drilled into every intelligence officer and field commander. Paper could be more dangerous than bullets. A single document in the wrong hands could unravel months of planning. Yet this particular map didn't feel routine the moment it was unrolled. It wasn't a standard issue chart pulled from a stab or printed in bulk. It was layered with handwritten notes, corrections, and observations gathered the hard way, through patrols that never came back and villages entered under fire. It showed Italy not as it appeared on official maps, but as it actually was. Broken, deceptive, and full of narrow chances. By late 1943, the Allied advance in Italy had slowed to a crawl. Every mile forward came at a brutal cost. The terrain was the real enemy now. Steep ridgelines, winding valleys, and mountains that turned entire divisions into easy targets. German forces knew this land intimately and built their defenses around that knowledge. They mined the obvious routes, fortified the passes everyone assumed were the only way through, and waited. On paper, the Allied options were painfully limited. But the map told a different story. It hinted at paths that weren't supposed to exist. Routes that looked impassable to anyone who trusted clean lines and printed symbols. The problem was that the map's value made it dangerous. If it fell into enemy hands, the Germans would instantly know their assumptions had been challenged. They would close gaps, shift defenses, and turn those narrow opportunities into death traps. That's why the order was so clear. If retreat became necessary, if capture even seemed likely, the map had to disappear. No debates. No exceptions. And yet, standing there with a lighter in hand, the officer holding it hesitated. Not because he doubted the rule, but because he understood the cost of following it. This was the kind of hesitation war rarely allows. The paper trembled slightly as the wind moved through the ruined building where the decision had to be made. Around him, the sounds of artillery echoed through the hills, a reminder that time was not on his side. Burning the map would mean safety in the narrow sense. It would mean the enemy learned nothing new. But it would also mean erasing knowledge that had been paid for in blood. Every penciled mark represented a patrol that scouted a ridge under fire. A local guide who whispered about a forgotten trail. A unit that noticed something didn't match the official charts. Destroying it felt less like following orders and more like erasing the truth. What made the choice even harder was that no one could yet prove the map would change anything. At that point in the campaign, optimism was a fragile thing. Plans failed as often as they succeeded. Commanders had learned to be skeptical of anything that sounded like a shortcut. But this map wasn't promising miracles. It wasn't offering an easy victory. It was offering options, and in Italy, options were rare. The difference between success and disaster often came down to whether a unit could move unseen. Whether a flank thought secure could suddenly be threatened. So the decision became a compromise, one born out of fear, intuition, and quiet defiance. Parts of the map were burned, just enough to satisfy the letter of the order if anyone asked later. But not all of it. Key details were memorized. Critical sections were sketched again on separate scraps of paper. The knowledge was broken apart, scattered, made harder to destroy all at once. If the original was lost, the understanding behind it might still survive. It was a gamble, and everyone involved knew it. If discovered, it would look like insubordination. In wartime, that could end careers or worse. As the flames consumed the edges of the paper, the officer watched carefully, committing the remaining lines to memory. He wasn't thinking about heroism or history. He was thinking about the men who would soon be ordered up those mountains. About the difference between walking into a prepared ambush and slipping through a gap no one believed was real. The map, even in fragments, represented a chance to change how the campaign unfolded. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, decisive ways that never made headlines. This moment, quiet and almost invisible in the larger story of the war, was where everything balanced. On one side was strict obedience and immediate safety. On the other was risk, secrecy, and the hope that information, if protected just long enough, could save lives. The Italian campaign would continue to grind forward. Bloodied and slow, but the consequences of this decision were already moving with it. The map was no longer just paper. It had become an idea, carried in minds rather than folders, waiting for the moment it could be used. By the time the map began to influence real movement on the ground, it no longer existed in its original form. There was no single sheet to point to, no artifact to frame and label as the turning point of the Italian campaign. What survived instead was knowledge, scattered across notebooks, briefings, and memories passed quietly from one officer to another. That made it harder to trace, but also harder to kill. The Germans could capture a document, but they couldn't easily capture an idea once it had been shared and understood. And in the slow, grinding war through Italy's mountains, that difference mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The first signs of the map's impact were subtle. Units began appearing in places the enemy didn't expect them to be. Patrols moved through valleys assumed to be impassable, emerging behind defensive lines that had been designed to face only one direction. These weren't dramatic breakthroughs announced over the radio. They were quiet adjustments. A supply column arriving without being shelled. An artillery position set up on a ridge the Germans believed unreachable. A night march that ended without losses instead of in disaster. Each small success reinforced the belief that the fragmented intelligence was working. That the terrain could be read differently if you stopped trusting official maps and started trusting what had been learned the hard way. One of the most important consequences was how it changed planning at higher levels. Commanders who had grown used to thinking in terms of limited corridors suddenly had more flexibility. When an assault stalled, there was often another option, a lesser-known route that could be tested rather than another costly frontal push. This didn't make the fighting easier, but it made it smarter. Instead of throwing men against fortified positions again and again, planners could look for ways around them. In a campaign defined by attrition, even small reductions in casualties added up quickly. The Germans, meanwhile, were caught off balance. Their defensive strategy in Italy depended heavily on predicting Allied movement. They had fortified the obvious approaches, invested enormous resources in controlling key passes, and trusted that the mountains would do the rest. When Allied units began slipping through gaps they believed were secure, it created confusion and forced rapid adjustments. Troops had to be redeployed, reserves shifted, and carefully constructed lines weakened to cover unexpected threats. The map hadn't made the enemy weak, but it had made them uncertain, and uncertainty in war is expensive. What's striking is how often the map's influence was felt without anyone openly acknowledging it. Reports would note success, mention favorable terrain, or credit good coordination. But rarely did they trace the outcome back to the intelligence that made it possible. That was intentional. The fewer people who knew the full story, the safer it remained. This secrecy also meant that when victories came, they felt almost accidental, as if fortune had finally turned in the Allies' favor. In reality, they were the result of information that had survived when it was supposed to be destroyed. As the campaign pushed northward, the accumulated effects became harder to ignore. German positions that were meant to hold for months fell more quickly than expected. Allied forces managed to outflank defenses that, on paper, should have been nearly impenetrable. Supply lines stabilized in areas where logistics had previously been a nightmare. None of this ended the war in Italy overnight, but it shortened battles and reduced the grinding stalemates that had defined the earlier stages. For the soldiers on the ground, that translated into fewer desperate assaults and fewer names added to casualty lists. Perhaps the most human impact of the map was felt by the men who never knew it existed. Infantry units followed orders to move through unfamiliar terrain, trusting that someone, somewhere, had done the work to make those routes viable. They didn't see the original sketches or the burned edges of the paper. They just knew that this time, the march didn't lead straight into machine gun fire. In war, that kind of outcome can feel like luck. In truth, it was the delayed result of a decision made months earlier, when someone chose to preserve knowledge instead of erasing it. After the war, as archives were jung-lied and histories written, the map's story remained largely invisible. There was no dramatic revelation, no single document that historians could point to and say, this is what changed everything. The intelligence had been absorbed into operations, its origins blurred by time and necessity. That may be why it took decades for its role to be understood at all. By then, many of the people who had carried its knowledge were gone, and the decision to ignore the order to burn it survived only in fragments of testimony. In the end, the map's legacy isn't about secrecy or defiance for its own sake. It's about the quiet power of information when it's protected just long enough to matter. In the Italian campaign, where progress was measured in yards and weeks, that power saved lives without ever asking for recognition. The map was meant to vanish, and in a way, it did. But what it revealed endured, shaping decisions, movements, and outcomes long after the paper itself had turned to ash.